Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a game between Alexei Shirov and Vishwanathan from their round 5 match play, rapid time controls held in Lyon, Spain, 2011. Let's have a look and see how Vishwanathan takes care of business using the Caro-Kann defense. So Alexei opening up with e4. We have this advanced variation indicated by e5. And already, just a few moves into the game, we could identify a few things. In particular, if we take a look at the bishops from both sides, we can already identify what is A, considered to be the good bishop, and B, the bad bishops. We could already say that as a result of the fixed pawn structure. These guys right here in particular, D4 and D5. If we are to just take a look at the black side first, that black pawn is on a light square. As a result, this is considered to be the bad bishop. And so just in comparison, if this is the bad bishop, then that implies this right here is going to be the good bishop. On the other side of the coin, looking on the white end, we have this d4 pawn for white fixed and on a dark square. So that implies this bishop is considered bad, and this one right here is considered good, because you basically want your pawns on one color complex and your bishop to be functioning on another. That way, your pawns aren't getting in the way of your own bishop. If your pawns could essentially get in the way of your own bishop, that bishop tends to be considered a bad bishop. So I know we're just a few moves into the game, and I'm already talking a whole lot about technical things like the good and bad bishops, but these are important things to recognize, and I feel that Anand is able to just reach a very simple position because he was able to just trade off his bad bishop for white's good bishop, and generally speaking, that's a very good idea. So let's just move forward here. We have bishop f5 and now h4, a move directed at preventing e6 at this position, because if it's played, the bishop's going to be cooked. How's it going to be cooked? Well, essentially these three guys here are going to take away all three squares from this bishop. First g4, bishop back, h5, bishop here, and now f3. So all these squares right here are just covered by the pawns. The bishop has nowhere to go, game over already. So of course we're not going to see that. So e6 is in play, but instead h5 taking aim, preventing that g4 advance. So bishop g5, queen b6, gets out of the pin that pawn was in and takes aim at b2. Now what's interesting to note is that there are a few instances during the course of this game where Anand has the opportunity to go ahead and grab that b2 pawn but chooses not to. And the reason I feel that he's not going for that is because he could just steer the game into more positional waters where he has more control over the position. There's not as much crunching of the numbers that would be needed. And so this right here is the first opportunity after white plays bishop d3. This is Anand's first chance to maybe go ahead and grab that pawn. I'll just show a quick variation. What might occur is after queen takes b, we might just have knight d2. And after maybe the exchange of bishops, white is down 2 pawns, but maybe eventually there's going to be some pressure on b7. And also, if black isn't careful, who knows, maybe white might have the idea of giving up a third pawn in that of e6. With that move, what that move essentially does is make life that much more difficult in order for black to go ahead and complete their king side development. So that's just maybe one brief variation which might have occurred if queen takes b2 at this juncture, but we don't have that. Instead, we just have the trade of black's bad bishop for white's good bishop. And now we have another instance where this pawn could maybe be taken, but it's not. Instead, we have the offering of a queen exchange, but just showing a quick what if the pawn is taken now, we might actually see something like knight f3, and if the rook is taken, maybe queen b3. And this sort of variation, I'm not so sure that this variation is the greatest, but if pawn takes like this, we could have queen b7, and black is actually going to be maybe in some serious hot water. So actually, in this position right here, instead of taking the knight with the pawn, black could take the rook and then take the knight here and try and restrain this white queen, but we actually might see e6, and then we do have a serious imbalance. I know that there's two black rooks and a minor piece as compensation for the lost queen, but it might still be a little bit tricky in order for black to go ahead and coordinate their forces. And this is kind of typical Shirov play, just really looking for an imbalance and just really mixing up the play. But we don't enter that sort of territory. Anand just simply doesn't go for taking the pawn on b2. So instead, we just have the offering of a queen exchange. I think black is already doing well as a result of being able to exchange off their light square bishop for white's light square bishop. Okay, Alexei avoids that exchange, and I think if white is looking to try and win the game, I think you kind of have to maintain the queens on the board. Otherwise, I think it might just turn out to be black that has a slight advantage, just, again, going by having now what is considered to be the better bishop. You know, if things were to simplify quite a bit, I think black would be doing better as a result of having the better bishop. So e6 is played before white could actually play e6 themselves. Knight e2, c5. This is the typical idea. You just want to strike at the white base, and as a continuation, we will be seeing knight c6, essentially adding more fuel to this d4 point. c3 to just try and keep things intact, and now knight c6, knight d2, knight e7, knight b3, capture on d4, and then get this knight to this f5 square, which is a very cozy home for him because it can't be easily chased away. There's no g4 because we have the pawn watching over that square, and we have this pawn, more fuel is added to that d4 pawn. So white castles, bishop e7. There's really not a better square for that bishop to go to. Now, I recognize, okay, I was emphasizing, all right, well, why is black now wanting to get rid of this dark square bishop? Well, unfortunately, there really isn't a better square for it to go to right now, and black really can't wait for forever to go ahead and complete their development. So bishop e7, we have the exchange, and now knight on c takes the bishop. I think this knight is great right where it is. In fact, it's you don't want to retreat that particular knight, because right now there's this threat that white has to now meet. Knight takes the pawn on h4, so g3 and now b6. g3 to watch over this pawn, b6 to watch over c5. We don't want any knight hopping in here and causing trouble. So knight f4 hits this pawn for what's now a second time, g6 lends support, and white's just looking to maneuver, eyeing this g5 square maybe. There's no attack here. I mean, you always do have to watch out if there's a queen and knight in proximity to your own king. That's usually grounds for some serious trouble. But I mean, there's knights which are close to the black king, two knights, and also this knight right here is stable, can't be easily chased away. It acts as a defensive piece. It's a multi-purpose knight. I think you could maybe consider it. It's defensive, and it's also aggressive, hitting at d4, which is constantly going to be needed. That d4 pawn constantly needs supporters. So queen f4, and now Anand takes the opportunity to just slip that queen in, just really snuffing out any thoughts that white might even have about maybe attacking the black king. You know, as soon as the queen, you know, she's controlling e2. As soon as that queen leaves, it's like bam, queen e2. She just slips right in there, and you know, if the pressure becomes insurmountable, the queen could just always play to g4, and eventually, you know, that's actually what ends up happening. At this point, we have rook f to d1, and this was another instance where, okay, maybe Anand could grab that b2 pawn. We already saw two instances earlier. Here's another one, and he's just not going for it. He doesn't really care about grabbing pawns. He sees, well, what am I in Anand's head right now? But just really looking at the position objectively, I think at least these were maybe some of the thoughts he was having during the course of the game. It's kind of like, well, I could always maybe just look towards having control over this C file, and I already have pressure against this pawn right here. I have a better pawn structure. This white knight right here maybe isn't the happiest piece in the world, doesn't have very many options, so maybe these small features of the position are good enough for Anand to just play it a little bit slower, just emphasizing the pluses that black has and the minuses that white has. So we just have the rook playing to the C file. Now if we're to look maybe just a little bit more technically at this position, why I always tend to question, when I'm reviewing a higher level game, why is it this particular rook instead of the other one that's making use of this half open file? And the reason I'm seeing for this, at least, is because maybe this pawn is going to need some support on f7. If knight g5, then there's this queen and knight that would then be converging on that f7 point, and so that would be tying down the f5 knight. So at least there's some role that this rook could be having. Keeping a rook on the a8 square to just stare at the a7 pawn, not very purposeful. So I think that's maybe just the quick reason why you move the a rook in this position to the c8 square opposed to the f8 rook. So moving forward, rook d8, rook to d2, and now the offering of a queen exchange. Queen takes queen, pawn takes queen, and the pawn's hitting the knight. So now knight to g5. I guess another move would just be knight f4. Not sure how much difference that makes, but what white is essentially going to have to do, this knight on g5 right now, as it stands, doesn't have a good square to go to. All the squares are covered by the black pawns, no safe squares. So in order for this knight on g5 to be liberated, we're going to have white is going to have to play f3 to take out the g4 pawn. We're gonna need that f3 move coming in, and that does get played. But first, black takes some action against this awkward placement of the b3 knight. a5, getting ready to just kick it around to a square that it's not gonna like. So f3, and black actually does nothing about the current tension that's going on between these two pawns. Instead, rook c4, pressure on that d4 pawn, and just preparing to double rooks. So king to f2, just a quick, if the pawn is taken, we just have knight h6, and then there's no way to prevent knight takes pawn on the next move. So king f2, the doubling of rooks, pawn takes pawn, knight h6, and if king to f3 in the position, that's a blunder. King f3, a4, and where's this guy going? Nowhere. He's cooked. So king f3 is no good. Instead, got the doubling of rooks, and unfortunately, we're having this doubling of rooks just so this knight can make use of a corner square. Not the greatest square in the world to go to. a4, knight in the corner. Knights on the rim are grim. What are knights in the corner? Not really good at all. Or insert your favorite line for that one. So things aren't looking so pretty at this point. The knight having to go to the corner square, and its future isn't so bright, is it? I mean, where can it go next? c2, it's just going to get killed. So that's not happening. In the meantime, black takes on g4 with check, king f3, and now knight to h6, followed by king f4. Now, at this point, actually, I really don't use computers all that much when I review games, but I was just very curious as to why maybe, I don't know what the time issue was, or if there was maybe like some sort of time scramble or whatever at this point in the game, but I just kind of questioned why was this king to f4 move played. Instinctually, at least for me, I would be maybe wanting to just do g4 because it takes away f5 from both knights. But that move wasn't played. I guess, white is still in some, still has a difficult road ahead, maybe just a slow advancing on the queen side. Maybe the knight can make use of c6 and put pressure on the d4 pawn again. I think it's just still a tough road ahead for white, but I was just a little bit curious of the choice to play king to f4 opposed to g4 in that position. So nevertheless, king f4 was played. We have knight f5, and now actually this particular move is just no good. For if in this position g4, then, well, that's just going to lose this pawn, right? Let me back up. I didn't mean to say that. So knight to f3, and now b5, and actually at this point right here, g4 would run into some serious problems. This knight move to e1 was played, but if g4 in this position, we could actually just take that pawn after the recaptured knight fork, and now let's say if king f4, we could take the rook. After this sequence of moves, rook e1, the only move to put up maybe the most resistance at this point. If if the rook just immediately captures, guess what? This guy that's in the corner is toast. So rook e1 allows, if rook takes rook, knight takes rook here, now there's at least some communication point on c2 for these knights. So maybe there's this game could potentially be saved at this point, but black does best to not take this rook just yet and press b5. This is an interesting variation right here. b5 prepares to now exchange rooks. Let's just make a fairly nothing type of move. This is what it's essentially planning after the exchange of rooks. Now, since now this pawn is on b4, if we have, let's say, this corner knight finally getting into play, we have b3. Chases this knight away, and then this knight is going to be lost. So that's what b4 prepares in that particular variation. Now let's just say, for example, white prevents this eventual b3 advance with playing b3 themselves. Now what we could have is this move right here, rook on 8 to c3, preparing to just take this knight with check and then take the rook. And if white avoids that with king to g4, we could just have a move like a3, and now talk about zugzwang. What in the world can white do? If the king goes to either g3 or f4, this knight gets taken with check, and then the rook is going to be lost. There's absolutely no other moves. I mean, what is there? So let's just consider h5. We have the exchange of pawns. Now we go with just rook takes knight, rook takes rook, rook takes knight, and look at this situation. We have a rook and pawn endgame, and no, not all rook and pawn endgames are drawn. This one is just going to be dead big time for white. This pawn is going to be lost very soon. This rook cannot, it's not going to be defendable. So those are just a couple what-if variations. Let's pretty much just see how this game finishes up, where the white king ends up going for a little stroll all the way over here on h6, ends up getting mated. Let's see how that happens. So we have b5, the knight, so instead of that g4 variation, we have the knight going back to e1, f3, just trying to break down the white center here. So a lot of calculation was just done right here. f6, pawn takes e5, another pawn sacrifice. This pawn is pinned to the king, so there's no pawn takes pawn. So king takes pawn, knight e3. Okay, so what was that particular move doing? This e5 advance is essentially luring the king away from the defensive e3. So after king takes pawn, knight e3 chases this rook, unfortunately, to b1. Look at just this this garbage setup essentially for these white knights, a knight in the corner, a knight on the rim, a rook having to only go to this b1 square staring at a pawn. And I'm not so sure what this rook is doing that's great at all. So we have rook check, king f4, one other what if the king were to go here, we could just have check, king here, check, and then did I miss something here? Eventually the white king gets mated. I might have mixed up the moves there, but essentially it's going to be mate no matter how you look at it. If the king were to run in this direction at this point right now, but instead we have king f4. Rook c6, looking to grab this pawn. The king defends it and attacks the knight, but Anand doesn't care. He just allows this knight to be taken. King takes knight, rook g4, taking more squares away from the white king. Knight f5 is the mate threat. There's only one way to defend. Rook f2, the knight lands a check. After the exchange, we have king h5. There's no way to meet the following mate. Coming up, rook c7, the rook swinging over in just a couple moves. It will be mate. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.